Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
We have a lot to cover today because we are talking about the Make America Healthy Again report. MAHA is short version of that title, but the MAHA report, which came out very recently in May and covers a lot of what we talk about on this podcast, in our newsletters, in our curriculum. I mean, literally everything we cover is touched by content in this report.
Our goal in everything we do is to help make sense of the information that's out in the world and give you our perspective on what is rooted in research and data, where there are still questions, right? Where the data is not clear or it hasn't been studied, where there's conflicting data, where families will choose to make their own choices based on their own community, culture, identity. And so there are going to be places where we'll say in this conversation, hey, listen, this is actually what we know. And there will be places where we'll say, hey, this is evolving and we don't have enough information. Our goal is not to be judgmental. Our goal is not to come down on one side of politics or another. Our goal is not to vilify individuals. Our goal is to help you understand what is understandable and what we get behind, and the places where we say, hey, you know what? We're not going to put a flag in the ground for tweens and teens on this topic. And we may not do it perfectly. We are human, and like everything else we do in life, we will do it imperfectly, but we're going to try our best because it's really overwhelming and there's so much out there and we want to be helpful.
So let's begin. I think the best place to begin, Vanessa, is an explainer of what the heck this report is. Because before I took my super deep dive into the content, read the report, oh my gosh, I can't even count how many articles now about the report, I actually didn't know why it was. I sort of had a vague understanding, but didn't really understand why it was coming out in the first place and what its goal was. So let's start there. Some facts. On February 13th of 2025, there was an executive order from the White House, from the president, mandating a report about the scope of the childhood chronic disease crisis. It's the language that came out. And it was required that the report was published within 100 days of that executive order. And then within 180 days of that executive order, it was required that strategies based upon the findings reported in the report would be announced. And this is a really important starting point because the report, by and large, doesn't have a lot of answers. It raises a lot of questions, but it doesn't have a lot of answers. And I think that's the sort of way it was laid out in this timeline has created a problem. We're used to getting information and then having solutions paired with that information. In this case, that is not the way it is set up.
And typically, Cara, scientific studies and reports take a lot longer than 100 days or 180 days. Can you talk about the timeline for the kinds of studies that we point to in our work and stuff that you use to rely on as a pediatrician?
Yeah, this was never meant to be a study, a scientific study where researchers went out and collected data and then reported back to the American people. But it was meant to be a very comprehensive look at all of the data and a report. We talk a lot about meta-analyses on this podcast, which are studies that combine a group of studies that have looked at a specific question. Certain studies are included in a meta-analysis, others are excluded. The reasons why those others are excluded are listed and made clear. Then you see all the studies that are included, and it's the data from those studies that are integrated into the results. That takes time. Meta-analyses take time. This is a report covering a massive swath of issues, and it didn't really get into that kind of detail. There are a lot of citations. The MAHA report's 73 pages long, and anywhere from a quarter to a half of every page is footnoted citations. There are a lot of people who will be thinking right now that, hey, I think I read an article last week saying a lot of those citations go to dead links or to non-existing articles. That is true. I did not click on those links, to be completely honest. I trusted that those links were valid, and that was an error. I think, we scientists, we have to check every link, and not every single link was active here.
And according to an article I read this weekend, links were corrected, but there are citations of studies that have actually, and citations of studies with authors that actually have never been conducted. So,
correct. Which makes people think maybe parts of this were written by AI. And I think that's something we're not really going to cover on this podcast, but I think is not unreasonable. And if anyone's sort of curious about that, we did a newsletter a month or two ago where we had ChatGPT write a newsletter for us. We were very transparent about it. And then we went into that newsletter and we annotated in fuchsia. We pointed out every error that was generated in this very professional sounding, very science-y sounding newsletter. And we clicked on every link that it cited. And I think almost every link went nowhere. So this was a phenomenon we experienced and we shared with our newsletter audience. That's why that flag has been raised. But this is why the report was required. And the introduction to the report basically says, really what we've been tasked with is creating a report that focuses on the following areas. And this is what they list in the introduction: diet, absorption of toxic materials, medical treatments, lifestyle, environmental factors, government policies, food production techniques, electromagnetic radiation, and corporate influence or cronyism. These are, I'm just pulling the words from there. The actual report doesn't go into all of these areas as specific areas. It consolidates them into 4 general sections, and we're going to go through those 4 sections. One entitled Poor Diet, one entitled Environmental Chemicals, one entitled The Crisis of Childhood Behavior in the Digital Age, which is really about lack of physical activity and chronic stress, and one entitled Over-Medicalization. So this is what we're going to get into. Before we start, Vanessa, I would love to read a very short excerpt from a newsletter that was published by Caitlin Jetlina. She is YLE, your local epidemiologist, a public health expert who became very well known in the COVID epidemic. I've been following her pretty much since day one of her newsletter. And she became so popular because she's such a sounding board of science-based, rational information that she has ended up on a series of national councils. She has hundreds of thousands of subscribers to her newsletter. And she wrote a newsletter about meeting with a group of MAHA grassroots organizers, and wrote this very beautiful newsletter about how she wasn't going to do it. She wasn't going to meet with them. And then she decided she would. And this is what I want to read before we jump into going through the report. If we are truly honest with ourselves, the systems that public health and healthcare built in the 20th century are not keeping up with the needs of Americans today. The world has changed. The information landscape has shifted dramatically. The genuine power of a curiosity-driven public, one that expects faster information, more transparency, and more agency, has been unleashed. Those of us in the health world are now at a crossroads. We can either double down on what we know, the old systems, the old way of doing things, or we can listen, learn, and evolve. Both instincts are understandable. Both instincts are necessary. But for me, I'm far more interested in the latter, figuring out better ways to serve Americans where they are now, not where we wish they were. And here's the most important part. Listening doesn't mean agreeing with everything. It doesn't mean validating falsehoods. It doesn't mean abandoning evidence or the values that guide me. It simply means understanding, truly understanding what is driving people's fears, frustrations, questions, and hope. Because if we don't listen, we will continue to build systems that overlook the people we are supposed to serve. And if we keep missing them, decisions about public health will continue to be made without our input. And we're already living with the consequences. So I think she gives us a really good case for listening to why people are so concerned about all of these issues. And if that's all we do right now is listen, that might be good enough.
Yeah. I mean, there's an article in this weekend's New York Times, actually, interestingly, in the Sunday Styles section. And it says something like, the MAHA moms have joined the chat. And it's, a reported piece with a journalist who goes and meets with different families from all over the country with different perspectives. And for all of this, we have to approach it with, where is people's fear coming from? Where are people's worries coming from? Where do they feel disserved? So we may have temptations to react to some of the stuff in this report, but I think we cannot dismiss the way parents feel, the incredible parents pressure and stress parents feel with all this information coming at them. And it talked about like 85% of mothers get health information from social media. That was the stat quoted in the article. And this report is highlighting some of that. And this report is also maybe perpetuating some stuff that we, don't necessarily feel is accurate. And I think this question of how do we listen and understand, even when we don't necessarily agree, is super critical to this conversation.
Right. I mean, there are some framing statistics that are presented at the top of the report that are completely spot on. More than 40% of the 73 million kids in the United States have chronic health conditions. And those include things like asthma and allergy and obesity and autoimmune disease and behavioral issues. More than 20% of all kids over the age of 6 are obese, which represents a 270% increase from the 1970s. And 80% of obese teens will be obese adults. And we know that there are all sorts of follow-along physical impacts of obesity. Today, 1 out of every 31 kids in the United States is diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. And that happens before they turn 8. That is a very big difference from prior. And people have a lot of feelings about why that is. And we'll get into it in a minute. But it's a number that bears stating. About 10%, I think it's closer to 11% of all kids are diagnosed with ADHD. That depression rates, which we talk about on this podcast all the time, have skyrocketed, right? They doubled between 2009 and 2019. That was before COVID. That more than 25% of girls reported a major depressive episode in 2022. Suicide rates increased by 62% between 2007 and 2021. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death in 15 to 19-year-olds. I mean, these are very real issues. And these statistics are not fabricated. We all know we have a lot of health issues in this country that we need to address.
So, Car, the report opens with the topic of ultra-processed foods. And honestly, I think this is probably, in some ways, the simplest and in some ways the most complicated topic in the report. And the report gets at, and I'll let you talk to, industry standards and categorizing and all of that stuff. But I want to talk about it from a kind of socio perspective, which is that we know that people are eating ultra processed foods. We know that whole foods are better for people. We know that more fruits and vegetables and whole grains are better than, processed foods and things high in sugar and saturated fats. I mean, there's no question about that. The two of us, also believe there's room for all of those foods that are super delicious and designed to be super delicious. But we also know that there are many millions of people living in this country who do not have access to whole foods in the same way that other millions of people in this country too. We talk often about the social determinants of health. If you want to go deeper into that, our episode with MAHA Feller, who is a registered dietitian and nutritionist, talked about her work near a hospital and trying to do a presentation and not being able to find the foods she needed for the presentation at the market right by the hospital. And there's all sorts of other aspects of living in this country that are actually obstacles to people being able to feed themselves and their families in the way that is recommended in this report.
Yeah, and if you're confused as to what an ultra processed food is, there are a lot of charts now that have been published online that walk through sort of how you get from an unprocessed food into an ultra processed food. There are kind of 3 or 4 steps along the way. The most classic is really divided into 4 buckets, right? You start with unprocessed, then you moved into processed ingredients. Like unprocessed is, you pluck an apple off a tree, interestingly, plain yogurt falls into a lot of people's unprocessed, but it's really minimally processed is the idea there. Then you get to processed ingredients, like you might have oil or butter or honey in a minimally processed food, but if you add those ingredients, it's considered more processed. Then you get into true processed foods, your breads on the shelf, your cheeses in the dairy section, your dried or cured meats, that kind of stuff. And then ultra processed is like, it's basically the stuff that is created by industry. There are a series of processing steps, a series of additives put into the food. And there's a goal: longer shelf life, no bacterial growth, stronger flavor, specific color, specific appearance, right? So what falls into ultra processed? Pretty much any kind of seasoned or sweetened, canned or jarred or packed food that you buy, soft drinks, candy, ice cream, cheese products. Cheese is processed. Cheese products are ultra processed. Baked goods, commercially produced breads, cereals. That's a big one that a lot of people have been talking about lately. Fruit drinks, sweetened yogurts, because they have all the ultra processed ingredients, right? You get the idea. The important thing here is what you said about social determinants of health. I had this conversation with my daughter as I was preparing for this episode. She took an environmental science course this semester at school, and she talked about how if you cannot pay an electrical bill and you cannot keep a refrigerator running, or you don't have the space for refrigeration, you are stuck with more ultra processed foods in your diet. Whole foods generally require refrigeration to expand their shelf life. That's refrigeration is a form of preservation. And so if you can't preserve food by putting it in a fridge, you have to use other techniques. And I thought that was such an interesting call out, like a place that connects all these dots. And, frankly, one of the biggest criticisms of the MAHA report is it did not mention social determinants of health. It did not acknowledge that these might be drivers of some of these issues. And a lot of people are kind of kicking and screaming about this. I think we're just going to leave it at that, is that it didn't acknowledge. The report brings up really good questions, Vanessa. It says, what are the impacts of ultra processed foods on the microbiome? We know the microbiome in the gut is a really important part of how we extract energy from foods. We know it's connected to inflammation. There's not a ton of data about, there's some, but not a ton. And the data that's out there does not look great. This will not surprise you. Ultra processed foods do not feed a microbiome in the most healthful way. We don't know a lot about microplastic contamination. A lot of ultra processed foods are then stored in cans or packages that are either plastic or plastic lined or have phthalates or BPA. And we don't know a lot about how much of that gets into the body on account of the ultra processed food consumption. There's a whole series of questions around the addictiveness of ultra processed foods, which is really a question of, is it that the foods drive people to eat more volume and therefore they just eat more ultra processed foods? Or is it that the foods themselves drive us because of the high sugar content, drive us to consume more of them? And all of this lands in this very awkward place, which is there's all the research funding is being pulled back on all this stuff. I mean, I think all these questions are so fair. You and I have joked about being raised in households that had really clean pantries and clean fridges. And I don't know how we're going to answer any of these questions that the report brings up looking at all the cuts.
Right. So like the cuts, and this is common sense. This is actually not a political statement. The agencies and the federal government responsible for researching all of the topics that we are going to cover, the CDC, the EPA, those agencies have significantly cut their staff. Those are also the agencies that measure things like microplastics that we'll get to it in a minute, that are looking at teen mental health. So we don't know how they're proposing to assess the effectiveness of the report or measures they may be putting in place as a result of this report if the bodies responsible for measuring the health of children in this country are no longer operating their studies. And so we're waiting to hear how that might happen.
One thing I was really happy to read about in the report was there was a real like yellow highlighter, not literally, but very figuratively, around lobbying. And I thought it was a really fair call out that there has been decades of lobbying. And it was frankly, this was woven throughout the whole report as well. There's been decades of lobbying, food industry, pharma, all of it, that has resulted in nutritional standards that are poor. And one very good example, and it's very well known, is that the food pyramid. Remember the good old food pyramid, which is a thing of the past, but it has really stuck with a lot of Gen Xers. It was really driven in large part by certain food lobbies that made sure that their food types were kept in certain sections. The cereal lobby is credited with the base of the pyramid. Like, I love cereal because I was raised on cereal. Cereal, by and large, is not a great way to start the day. Frankly, it's not a great meal. I think it's what I should start my day with because that frickin' food pyramid. And I think this is an important thing to sort of acknowledge, but you're exactly right. Here are some other things that sort of reality checks along the food stuff. So you talked about food deserts, cost. There's no mention of the difference in cost between ultra processed foods and fresh or whole foods. Portion size. I don't know if you found any references to portion size in here, but I did not see one reference to portion size.
I did not see a reference.
Fascinating, because that's a huge driver of a lot of the problems that are associated with
just
food.
Historically, what CAR means is the portion size in the history of this country has gotten increasingly larger. And so what a portion is, and therefore the calorie, fat, all of the associated nutritional information has expanded, as well as have the size of plates that Americans use. And so people are just ingesting more food than they used to.
Literally, spoons are bigger. Forks are bigger. Bagels, the bagels we used to buy were like, could fit in the palm of my hand. Now they're the size of my head. I'm not joking. They're the size of my head. This is significant.
I mean, also, like, we're not going according to LA bagels. I'm just going to say.
Fair. But the last thing before we move to the next topic is the expectation about how food looks and tastes. And I felt this way for, I would say, a couple of decades, where you go into a mass market like Costco and you look at the produce section and every apple has to look gigantic and perfect, right? Natural foods that are grown without pesticides and all the things, right? Don't look that pretty. You look at chicken breasts in the poultry section, and it doesn't take much to find a documentary or a book that talks about what our meat supply is being fed in order to grow bigger and bigger and bigger before it comes to the market. I think there needs to be a dramatic readjustment on the consumer side to want to buy foods that don't look the way that we're used to buying them now. Not every apple is going to be perfectly round, perfectly green or red, perfectly waxy and shiny. Like those should be signs that, this is not supernatural.
And that gets us to the next bucket in the report, which are environmental chemicals. Again, a massive universe of, everything from pesticides to, the endocrine disrupting chemicals in cosmetics to thousands and thousands of other chemicals. You talked about microplastics, household products, our raincoats, right? It's the forever chemicals. I mean, it's on and on and on and on. So I appreciate the effort to cover such a big topic, but it's impossible to cover such a massive topic in such a short time frame and in such limited space. And I will reiterate my point, which is those are chemicals that we are in the process of researching and understanding their impact on the environment and on the human body at all its stages of growth and development. And without that research and without that data, we will be losing a lot of really important insights on how to go forward with this process. But a part of the topic we have covered here, and we have begged for more research and data, are the endocrine disrupting chemicals, because we now have evidence that at least one of them, muscambret, acts as, and the theory has been that these chemicals tip kids into puberty earlier. And we now know that at least one of them, and the theory is obviously that many more of them, muscambret is the one that we have the research about, that it causes the hypothalamus to release GnRH and send it to the pituitary gland to then release LH and FSH. And it literally jumpstarts puberty earlier, right? So that is one of thousands and thousands and thousands of chemicals that are affecting the health and safety and realities of American children.
I mean, we probably should have started the episode with this statement, but better late than never. I was struck by the fact that this report was about children. It was not about adults. It was about children and children's health, especially in the environmental chemicals section. But really, as I was reading the whole thing, I was stunned by the fact that every single one of these things applies to every single person's health and wellness. So there is nothing about environmental chemicals when we talk about them that is only impactful in pediatric health. However, as you bring up, Vanessa, there's a lot about a lot of these topics in the report that have specific callouts in infants, toddlers, school-age kids, tweens, teens, and young adults. Muscambret is a perfect example of that. It's also true, and they call this out very specifically in the environmental chemical section of the report, that when kids' blood is checked for things like pesticides and microplastics, these are found in kids' blood. By the way, they're also found in adults' blood. It is true that kids have increased susceptibility. And there are two main drivers of this, actually three, I should say. One is what's called increased body surface area. So think about a toddler and the way a toddler is built versus a typical adult. And there's just more absorptive surface. There's more skin relative to what's inside the body. It's easier for things to get into the toddler body. If it's slathered all over the toddler body, it's easy to slather something all over the toddler body. So there's increased body surface area relative to the whole person. There's also this thing that infants and toddlers do, and a lot of school-age kids, which is everything goes into their eyes, nose, and mouth. Like literally their fingers are in their eyes and nose and mouth all the time. And like I had this thing where when my kids were between 12 and 24 months, I actually did not fly with my kids because it was so disgusting watching them on the floor of the airport licking everything.
My youngest sucked his thumb, and I used to take him to public bathrooms, and I'd be like, okay, now after you sit on the toilet, because you've seen how toddlers are in toilets. They literally put their hands like all over the toilet. They like grip onto the most disgusting parts of the toilet. I'm like, after you sit on the toilet, let mommy wash your hands before you suck your thumb. And he would look at me and nod, right? And I'd put him on the toilet seat, and he'd basically run his hands all over the toilet bowl and the toilet seat while going to the bathroom. And like, literally before I could grab his little hand and before he would just stick it right back in his mouth. And it was like, I was gagging watching. It was so disgusting. And I just kept saying to myself, like, maybe this will make his immunity better because it's like
Exactly.
so vile to watch. Yeah. So Cara, I totally relate.
He was self-immunizing for sure. But I mean, that body surface area, the exposures, and then also their brains are under construction, right? Their nerves and their brains are unmyelinated until they're myelinated. When they're unmyelinated, they're uncovered. They're actually more susceptible to a lot of the chemicals and toxins that float in and around the brain. And so it just like the point being, this is a report about children that applies to all people, but I think some of the call outs are specific to kids, particularly because environmental chemicals can make their way into bodies a little more easily. Vanessa, I think we land in a similar place on environmental chemicals as we do on diet and nutrition, which is we appreciate the call outs for about lobbying and how that has driven a lot of policy and a lot of exposure. I really appreciate that the report calls out that a lot of the studies done about safety of environmental chemicals are industry-led studies. Now, there are a lot of studies that are not industry-led that were not cited in the report in quite as much detail as I would have liked. It felt a little unbalanced to me, but it is a very fair call out that there's a lot of industry data out there, but there are also huge buckets of things that were missed. Like I didn't see air quality in this report. And we all breathe.
Hopefully. And Cara, we also know that there is decreased regulation on many of these topics. So the report calls out the risks of these substances, and yet we are in a moment where there is significantly less regulation of these substances in our environment, in our water, in our air, in our products. So again, we're left with the same conundrum of being presented with the problem, but with not a lot of guidance or even real concerns about how those problems are going to be addressed as a result.
Okay, Vanessa, we've made our way halfway through the report. Now we're at the section that's called The Crisis of Childhood Behavior in the Digital Age. And it's hard for me to be kind of super objective here in the setup of this part, because if you're not going to read the report, you need to know this is like a hodgepodge trash can of topics that all got piled into one section, some of which seems connected and some of which feels very, very random. There's a chaos factor to this section. So it's like, it's hard to be as balanced, because this is the section that I don't know about you, but this is the section I struggled with the most.
I would say for parents of tweens and teens, this is the bucket of topics that keep us up. This is the bucket of topics where, and I will say this, I think there's been a tremendous amount of fear mongering for parents. And it's where we feel paralyzed and where, honestly, it feels like the world is telling us that we have failed our children. And as folks who've been doing this job of parenting tweens and teens for quite a while, I will say, and I'll say this on behalf of both of us, that if you're parenting kids through this stage of life, which is unpredictable in itself, and you're dealing with literally burgeoning topics like technology and screens and, all of its impacts, it is going to be uneven and you're not always going to do a perfect job. And so to be made to feel like we failed our children, I think is really rough. I also think, Cara, the mental health data that they cite in this report, and we've discussed this on other episodes, is from 2021. It's from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, right? We're being told we failed our children because of tech and social media, and our children are in crisis because there's a mental health crisis. But the data they cite is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that was conducted really still during COVID. It was from
right
2021.
Yes.
So the data is very alarming. It's also data that was pulled when kids were not in school. They were stuck at home. They were socially isolated. They weren't getting enough exercise. All sorts of really, really, really powerful forces were at play on their mental health. And there's no recognition of that as the data that was cited. They sort of took the worst case scenario data.
There's going to be no follow-up data because the Youth Risk Behavior Survey has been postponed, suspended, not funded. So it's like, here we have this data, it's ugly data. There's no one who would argue with that. It's hideous. It's what happened to kids and had been happening pre-COVID. Let's acknowledge was like slowly rolling out over decades. We can't see where it goes from here because the data is not being collected right now.
Right. So the 2023 data, which should have come out this year, we've only received dribbles of that, and we may not ever receive that data. And the data that should be collected, it's collected every other year on odd years. In 2025, that research has been suspended. So not only are we not getting the 23 data, but we're also not collecting the 25 data.
Right. Which is like the fastest path to making the case you want to make with the ugly numbers is to not have any follow-up data. So there's no way to prove what direction, if we're getting better or not. I mean, there's some things that the report lays out that are very true and correct, and I want to walk through them really fast. It is true that teen screen use averages around 9 hours a day. That's Common Sense Media data. It is true that the vast majority of kids and teens fail to get 60 minutes of exercise per day.
Can I just pause on the 9 hours a day? That includes the screen time that they're using for school.
Right. No, it does not include school time, but it does include multi-device time counted separately. So like if they're listening to music while they're watching a show, that double counts.
Got it.
So that's why that number feels impossibly high. It is true that kids don't get the recommended 8 hours of sleep per night. By the way, all of these things are true for adults too. They're on devices an absurd amount of time. They do not get 60 minutes of exercise a day on average, and they don't get 8 hours of sleep at night. So okay. It is also true, and they point this out, that free play is critically important for development. We agree. And that kids don't get PE in school in the volume they used to. We agree. That is connected in some part to funding, which gets very complicated. I don't want to be editorial there, but just to say that this is not like an innocent bystander thing. It's not like there are reasons why, and these people have been yelling from the rafters for a long time to get more activity and exercise into schools. But it is true.
And by funding, we mean funding from the Federal Department of Education that has since been cut by 90%.
And will be closed.
Will be closed. So again, another point where it's like, oh, okay, well.
So all of these things are true. I'm going to give you two little examples of places where I felt frustrated by the way the data was presented. One, they talked about kids not getting enough sleep at night. They never mentioned delayed melatonin surges and early school start times and what some states are trying to do to get kids more sleep, because we know teenagers especially have trouble falling asleep early. Yes, screens are involved. Yes, anxiety is involved. Yes, overscheduling is involved, but also melatonin is involved. In their chronic sleep deprivation data, they actually cited a study that looked at getting less than 4 hours of sleep per night. That is very unusual. We're really looking at kids not reaching 8. I don't know a ton of them who are getting less than 4. And of course, there is no mention of safety as a significant driver of sedentary lifestyle. So whether it's you can't go outside in your neighborhood to play because it's not safe, there is no safe way to get to an activity to move your body. There is like all the things that layer on. None of it is mentioned.
And the cost of getting activity as extracurricular activities become more and more expensive and gated by fee paying.
Right. And I'll add that where this bucket got infuriating to me is when there was a whole section thrown in about family dynamics. It was like, I didn't even know what to do with this. It was 4 random items that they are apparently tethering to the worsening of mental health, but I'm just going to read them because if someone a listener can help me understand what the heck they're doing in this section of this report, that frequent family meals are associated with lower rates of disordered eating, substance use, violent behavior, and depression or suicidal ideation. I would love to see that exact data. I know family meals are important in terms of communication and reducing risk, but those specific data, I love to take a look at. Number 2, that single parent homes are associated with worsening mental health outcome in teens, which felt like a couple of leaps across some very broad territory there. Number 3, that single family parent structure has increased from 9 to 28% between 1960 and 2012. It's 2025. And number 4, that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are 2 to 3 times more likely to struggle with their mental health. Like, these are 4 very big statements. The data is not super crystal clear, and they're like tossed in there. I felt like, Vanessa, gaslighting families. I really did.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're doing the best we can. There's a million reasons why these are potentially the reality, although without appropriate citation, it's hard for us to dig into that. And, there's all sorts of other judgmental comments about parenting styles and things like that, which we will not spend time on, only we will recognize with a little smile on our faces. Cara, let's close with this bucket they call over medicalization. It could also be called medicalization. And I just want to point out that they talk about increased diagnosis rates and prescription rates, but there's not necessarily a recognition of just like higher awareness of things like mental health or diagnoses of some of these conditions, a normalization of mental health issues and struggles, right? They talk about the end result, which is higher rates, but not actually some of the positive things and progressions in our society and culture that might lead to these higher rates.
Right. So they do things in this section of the report, like they say antidepressant prescription rates have increased 14-fold between 1987 and 2014. By the way, I don't know, I didn't click on the link as to whether that was pediatric specific or not, and whether it was a specific age group within the pediatric window. They point to psychotherapy being very effective. And later in this section, basically there are very few recommendations that come out of this report, because remember, the recommendations are supposed to come in another couple months. But one of the very strong recommendations they make is kids should not be prescribed these medicines. They should see a therapist. Great. Like, how do we help kids get access to and coverage for therapy appointments? Therapists during COVID were able to see patients virtually and get reimbursed. That has gone away. The number of people trained as therapists, especially in the world of pediatrics, it's not nearly enough to meet the need. So I'm all for having mental health providers available to these kids, but it needs to be funded and there needs to be access, and we're not there yet.
And the concerns that I'm hearing from people are their teenagers who are on SSRIs, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety medications, and they are concerned that this report and other messaging from Secretary Kennedy is a beginning process of eliminating the ability for these teens to receive the prescriptions that they have been getting to help with their mental health issues. And I have spoken to parents who are petrified of their children losing access to these medications.
I mean, there's a long section, Vanessa, that goes diagnosis by diagnosis to call out how it's being treated and how ineffective or scary the treatment is. Psychiatric drugs leading to adverse events like seizures. It's something called a TNA, an adenotonsillectomy, taking out your adenoids and tonsils. For sleep apnea, they claim there's no benefit. Ear tubes for chronic ear infections, they claim there's no benefit. Drawing blood to look for signs of inflammation, the claim is that's traumatic and unnecessary. SSRIs, as you've mentioned, there's a call out of the black box warning about suicidal ideation. And then there's a very long section about vaccines and the inference that there is excessive use of vaccines and ineffectiveness. And I will say this in the last couple of minutes. I was talking to my mom this weekend about this report. We were teasing that, back in the 70s and 80s, my mom would have presented as a MAHA mom. She was no preservative. She was this, she was that. And yet she was very science oriented. And we were talking about vaccines, and we were talking about something that the report calls out, which is the sheer number of vaccines that are given today versus 30 or 40 years ago. And how today the average kid under the age of 2 has gotten 29 vaccines instead of 3 vaccines, I think were the numbers. And I was telling my mom how frustrating it was to see the framing like that in the report, because it was framed as if that was a harm to children, when really you can be protected against all of these life-threatening diseases. And there are 2 ways to go about the conversation, but you can't be in conversation if it's presented as a risk. And the data really supports the safety of vaccine. And my mom then left our conversation and went to a dinner. And I cannot make this up. The guy sitting next to her was talking about the MAHA report. And he said that he read it. And then he sat his 2 sons down. They're in their late 20s. And he said, now, if either one of you decides you want to get married, you have to promise me right here, right now, that before you propose, you will make sure that the person you are marrying will not vaccinate your children, because I don't want to have a child who has autism. And that was an incredible moment where I realized really where we've landed with this report is that it's marketing. It's an attempt to reach out to constituencies and take a temperature on people's reactions. And then I think we're going to see in 2 months a bunch of suggestions or recommendations that come out, but these waters have been tested. Let's see what floats to the top. And I think the vaccine section is a perfect example of that this is messaging that's been tested for 20 years. It's framed this way in this report. And we're going to see a series of recommendations that come out based upon what's covered in the New York Times, what's covered on Instagram, what's covered in water cooler conversation. And that's not how science should be done.
So we will follow up when the report with recommendations comes out, but please be in touch. Questions, thoughts, reactions, podcast@lessawkward.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.